Imagine waking up after 7 months in a coma, only to find your own son gave your house away to his in-laws. They thought you'd never wake up, but I did. And what I did next completely shocked them. You won't believe how I took back my home and my life. Stay tuned, because this story gets intense. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you enjoy powerful stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love reading every single one. My name is Helen Carter, and I'm 65 years old. For more than 30 years I lived in a quiet neighborhood called Willow Creek, just outside Cleveland, Ohio. It's the kind of peaceful American suburb where neighbors wave from their porches, and everyone more or less knows each other. My late husband, George Carter, and I bought our little 2-story house there when we were young. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. That house held our entire life. Raising our only son Michael, celebrating birthdays in the kitchen, and quiet Sunday mornings on the front porch. After George passed away 15 years ago, that house became more than just a home to me. It became my memories, my comfort, and the one place in the world that still felt truly mine. I lived a simple life, working for years at the local Willow Creek Public Library, keeping to myself and believing that family always looks out for one another. But about 7 months ago, something happened that changed everything. And that's where my story really begins. About 7 months ago, my life changed in a way I never could have imagined. It was a chilly evening in late October. The kind of night in Ohio where the air feels sharp and the streets are quiet after sunset. I had just finished grocery shopping at Willow Creek Market, and I was driving home along Harrison Avenue, thinking about nothing more than what I'd cook for dinner. Life felt ordinary that night. Peaceful. I remember the radio playing softly, and I remember stopping at a red light near the old Maple Street intersection. Then suddenly, everything happened in a blur. Bright headlights, a loud screech of tires, and then, boom, a pickup truck slammed straight into the side of my car. The force of the impact spun my little sedan across the road like it was nothing but a toy. Glass shattered, metal screamed, and then, everything went black. The next thing I learned later from the doctors was that the driver had run the red light going nearly 50 miles per hour. They said it was a miracle I even survived. I suffered a serious head injury, several broken ribs, and internal bleeding. The paramedics rushed me to St. Matthew's Medical Center in Cleveland, where doctors fought for hours to stabilize me. But my body had taken too much trauma. And sometime during the night, I slipped into a coma. For 7 long months I lay in that hospital bed, completely unaware of the world around me. Machines breathed beside me. Nurses came and went. Doctors checked monitors and quietly spoke in medical terms my family barely understood. And while I was lying there between life and death, the people I trusted most began making decisions about my life. Decisions I never agreed to. Decisions that would eventually break my heart. But at that time, I knew none of it. All I knew was darkness and silence. Until one day, 7 months later, I finally opened my eyes. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the sound. A slow, steady beep, beep, beep from the machines beside my bed. The hospital lights felt too bright, and my whole body felt heavy, like I had been sleeping for years. For a moment, I didn't even understand where I was. Then a nurse walked into the room and suddenly froze. Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness! Mrs. Carter!" She hurried over to my bed and leaned close to my face. "Can you hear me?" My throat felt dry and weak, but I managed to whisper, "Yes." Her face immediately filled with relief. "She's awake," she called out into the hallway. Within seconds, a few nurses came rushing in. They checked the monitors, asked me simple questions, and gently explained what had happened. That's when one of them softly told me something that made my heart skip. "You've been in a coma for 7 months. 7 months. The number felt impossible to understand. 7 months of life had passed without me even knowing. My first thought was about my son. Michael, I whispered. Is my son here? The nurse smiled kindly. I'll let your family know you're awake. About an hour later, the door slowly opened. And there he was. My son Michael Carter walked into the room, followed by his wife Angela. Michael looked different. Older somehow, more tired than I remembered. But when he saw me awake, his face softened. Mom, he said quietly as he came closer. He gently held my hand, and for the first time since waking up, I felt a little comfort. I can't believe you're awake, he said. The doctor said it might take longer. Angela gave a small smile from the corner of the room. How are you feeling? Michael asked. Like I got hit by a truck, I said softly, trying to joke a little. He chuckled nervously. Well, you kinda did. For the next few minutes he asked simple questions. If I was in pain, if I remembered the accident, if I needed anything. Nothing serious, just normal concern. And honestly, at that moment I felt grateful just to see him. The doctors kept me in the hospital for a few more days so they could monitor my recovery. My body was still weak and they wanted to be sure everything was healing properly. Michael visited every day. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he just sat beside the bed scrolling on his phone while I rested. Angela came along once or twice, though she mostly stayed quiet. 3 days passed like that. Slowly my strength began to come back. On the morning of the 4th day, the doctor came into my room with good news. Well, Mrs. Carter, he said with a smile, if everything looks good today, we can start preparing your discharge. Hearing that made me feel relieved. After 7 months in a hospital bed, all I wanted was one thing: to go home. Later that afternoon, when Michael came to visit, I smiled at him. Honey, I said, the doctor said I might be able to leave soon. That's great, Mom, he replied. I nodded. So maybe tomorrow you can take me back to the house. I'd really like to sleep in my own bed again. The moment those words left my mouth, Michael's smile disappeared. He looked down at the floor. Angela, who had been sitting near the window, slowly crossed her arms. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I frowned slightly. Michael, I said. What's wrong? He rubbed the back of his neck, the way he always did when he was nervous. Mom, there's something we need to talk about. Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. He glanced briefly at Angela before looking back at me, and then he said the words that would change everything. Mom, about the house. When Michael said, Mom, about the house, something inside my chest tightened. A mother knows when something isn't right. And in that moment, I could feel it. The room suddenly felt colder. I slowly pushed myself up a little in the hospital bed, wincing as my ribs reminded me they were still healing. What about the house, honey? I asked softly. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the floor like a little boy who had just been caught doing something wrong. Angela let out a quiet sigh beside the window. I noticed the way she crossed her arms, the way her expression stayed completely calm, almost impatient. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. Mom, you've been in the coma a long time, he began carefully. I know, I said gently. 7 months, the nurses told me. He nodded. Well, the doctors told us at one point that you might not wake up. My heart skipped a beat hearing that. I swallowed slowly. But I did wake up, I said quietly. Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Yeah, you did. Angela finally spoke then. Her voice sounded cool, almost casual. What Michael is trying to say is that things were uncertain. I looked from one of them to the other, confused. Uncertain about what? For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Michael took a deep breath and finally said it. Mom, we didn't think you were going to make it. Hearing your own child say those words out loud, it does something to your heart. I looked down at the hospital blanket covering my legs. Well, I said quietly, I guess the good Lord had other plans. Michael gave a nervous laugh, but it quickly faded. Then he rubbed the back of his neck again. And since we thought, you know, that you might not wake up. He paused again. Angela stepped forward slightly. Michael, just tell her, she said. My stomach twisted. Tell me what? Michael finally forced the words out. So, during that time, Angela's parents needed a place to stay. I blinked slowly. Needed a place to stay? Angela nodded as if explaining something completely normal. They were having financial problems, she said. Their lease ended and they couldn't renew it. I listened carefully, still trying to understand where this conversation was going. So we helped them, Michael added quickly. That's kind of you, I said. But something in my chest was starting to feel heavy. Michael looked at Angela again before continuing. And since the house was well empty, my heartbeat grew louder in my ears. We let them move in. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. You let them stay at my house? I asked slowly. Michael nodded. Just temporarily, he said quickly. Angela tilted her head slightly. Well, it started temporary, she corrected. My hands tightened slightly around the blanket. What does that mean? Michael looked extremely uncomfortable now. He took a deep breath before saying the next part. Mom. After a while we figured. He hesitated again. Angela finished the sentence for him. We figured the house would eventually belong to us anyway. The words hit me like ice water. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Eventually. Michael quickly tried to explain. I mean, not like that, Mom. It's just, if you hadn't woken up. My chest felt tight again. But I did wake up, I repeated softly. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Michael finally said the words that truly shattered something inside me. So, Angela's parents have been living there for about 3 months now. 3 months. 3 months strangers had been living in the house my husband built with his own hands. 3 months sleeping in my bedroom, using my kitchen, walking across the floors where my son once learned to walk. I stared at Michael. And you didn't think to ask me? His eyes darted away. Well, you were in a coma. Angela shrugged lightly. And honestly, we didn't expect you to recover this quickly. The way she said it felt cold. Like she was talking about a delayed package instead of a human being. I slowly took a breath. So when I leave this hospital tomorrow, I looked directly at my son. Where exactly do you expect me to go? The room went silent. Michael opened his mouth, but no words came out. Angela answered instead. Well, you could stay somewhere else for a while, she said casually. Maybe a small apartment or assisted living place. Assisted living. Hearing that word at 65 years old made my stomach twist. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't incapable. I had just survived a coma. And suddenly my own family was talking like I was already finished with life. I felt something warm sting behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of them. Instead, I looked at Michael. My house is still in my name, I said quietly. He shifted uncomfortably again. Yeah, technically. Technically. The word echoed in my mind. Angela spoke again. Well, the important thing is that my parents live there now, she said. And it would be really disruptive for them to move again. Disruptive. That word did it. Something inside me slowly began to harden. I realized something in that moment. My son wasn't just confused. He had already made his decision. And apparently, I was no longer part of it. I leaned back against the hospital pillow and looked up at the ceiling for a long moment. Then I slowly nodded. All right, I said softly. Michael looked surprised. All right. I turned my head and looked at him again. Yes, sweetheart. My voice stayed calm. Almost too calm. We'll figure something out. Angela looked relieved. Michael sighed like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But what neither of them noticed was the quiet thought forming in my mind. Because while they were busy deciding my future, they had forgotten one very important thing. That house was still legally mine. And once I left that hospital, I was going to remind them exactly whose house it really was. And trust me, they were not going to like how I did it. That night, I didn't sleep much. Hospitals are never quiet. Machines beep, nurses walk through the halls, doors open and close every few minutes. But that wasn't what kept me awake. It was Michael's words. Angela's parents have been living there for about 3 months now. 3 months. I kept picturing strangers walking around my house, opening my cabinets, sitting in my living room, maybe even sleeping in the bedroom that Robert and I shared for 30 years. Every memory in that house meant something to me. And somehow my own son had handed it over like it was nothing. I stared at the ceiling for hours that night. Now listen, honey, when you get to 65 years old, life teaches you something important. You learn that reacting in anger rarely helps. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm and think. So that's exactly what I did. I thought. And the more I thought about it, the more one thing became clear. Michael might have let people move into my house, but he did not own that house. Not legally. And that tiny little detail? Well, it was about to become very important. The next morning the doctor came in with a clipboard and a big smile. "Well, Mrs. Carter," he said, "your recovery is looking good. If you're comfortable walking a little, we can discharge you today." Walking still hurt, but I managed a slow lap around the hallway with the help of a nurse. My ribs protested the whole time, but I pushed through it. After 7 months in a coma, even standing felt like a victory. By the afternoon, the paperwork was ready. Michael arrived to pick me up. Angela was with him again. She stood near the window scrolling through her phone while Michael helped me into a wheelchair. "Ready to go home, Mom?" he asked. I looked at him carefully. "Sure am." Now here's the funny part. Neither of them actually said where we were going. And I didn't ask, because I wanted to see exactly what they were planning. The nurse wheeled me out to the hospital entrance where Michael's silver Toyota Camry was parked. The cool Ohio air hit my face the moment we stepped outside. Felt good. Fresh. Real. Michael helped me carefully into the passenger seat. "Take it easy, Mom," he said. "Doctor said you still need rest." Angela slid into the back seat and shut the door. And just like that, we started driving. For the first few minutes nobody spoke. The road stretched ahead of us as we left St. Matthew's Medical Center and merged onto the highway. I watched the familiar streets of Cleveland pass by through the window. 7 months had changed things. New stores. Different signs. The world had kept moving without me. Michael cleared his throat. "So we set up a place for you to stay for a bit," he said. I kept my voice calm. "Oh, yeah," he continued quickly. "Just temporary. Until we figure things out." Angela finally looked up from her phone. "It's actually a nice place," she said casually. I glanced back at her. "What kind of place?" She shrugged. "Senior apartments." Senior apartments. Now listen. I may be 65, but I'm not ready to start playing bingo at 3 p.m. every day. Still, I didn't react. Instead, I just nodded slowly. "That's thoughtful of you." Michael relaxed a little hearing that. "Yeah, it's only about 15 minutes from the house," he said. There it was again. The house. Not your house. Just the house. I looked out the window again as the car turned off the highway. Soon the streets became familiar. The grocery store on the corner. The old gas station. The park where Michael used to play baseball as a kid. And then finally, we turned onto Willow Creek Drive. My heart skipped. Michael slowed the car slightly as we passed my neighborhood. For a moment, I thought he might actually stop at my house. But instead, he kept driving. Right past it. I turned my head just in time to see it. My little white 2-story house with the maple tree in the yard. Except something was different. There was a large pickup truck in the driveway, and two unfamiliar cars parked along the curb. Angela noticed me looking. "Yeah," she said casually. "My parents have two vehicles. Two vehicles. Parked in my driveway." Michael quickly kept driving. A few minutes later we arrived at a small apartment complex called Silver Meadows Senior Living. Michael parked the car. "Well, here we are." I slowly turned my head and looked at the building. It wasn't terrible. Clean. Quiet. But it wasn't my home. Angela opened her door. "Honestly, this will probably be easier for everyone," she said. Easier for everyone. Those words sat heavy in the air. Michael helped me out of the car and into a wheelchair again. As we rolled toward the entrance, I noticed something interesting. Angela walked ahead of us, already talking about furniture and decorations. Michael looked relieved, like the problem had already been solved. But neither of them noticed the small smile forming on my face. Because during that car ride, I had already made a decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to yell. And I definitely wasn't going to beg for my own house back. No, sir. Instead, I was going to do something much smarter. Something quiet. Something legal. And when Michael and Angela finally realized what I had done, well, let's just say they were going to have a seriously bad day. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply reminding people who actually owns the house. Now let me tell you something about getting older, honey. People start underestimating you. They think because your hair turns gray and your steps get a little slower, that your mind slows down too. Well, that's a load of nonsense. By the time I reached 65, I had learned more about life and people than most folks half my age. And sitting there in that little apartment at Silver Meadows, I realized something very clearly. Michael and Angela thought the problem was solved. They thought they had quietly moved me out of the way. But they forgot one important detail. That house on Willow Creek Drive? It was still legally mine. Every single inch of it. The apartment Michael set me up in was small but clean. One bedroom. A tiny kitchen. A living room just big enough for a couch and a coffee table. Angela dropped a couple grocery bags on the counter. "There's some food here," she said. "Soup, bread, a few things like that." Michael helped me sit down on the couch. "Just take it easy for a while, Mom," he said. "Focus on getting stronger." I nodded calmly. "I will." Angela looked around the room and sighed. "Well, this should work fine for now." For now. Those words stuck in my head. They stayed about 10 more minutes talking about random things. Mostly Angela discussing furniture, and how her parents were finally getting comfortable in the house. Comfortable. In my house. Eventually Michael stood up. "We should head out," he said. "You need rest." Angela grabbed her purse. "If you need anything, just call." I smiled politely. "Oh, I will." They walked out the door a minute later. And just like that, I was alone. The apartment grew quiet. For a long moment, I simply sat there staring at the wall. Not angry. Not crying. Just thinking. Then slowly, I reached over and picked up the phone sitting on the small side table. There was one person I needed to talk to. A man who had helped my husband and me many times over the years. My lawyer. Richard Lawson. Richard had been practicing law in Cleveland for nearly 40 years. Tall fellow, always wearing those square glasses and expensive suits. But more importantly, he was loyal. My late husband George Carter trusted him completely. And after George passed away, Richard helped me handle all the paperwork for the house, which meant he knew exactly who owned it. I dialed his number. The phone rang twice. Then I heard his familiar voice. "Lawson and Associates." "Richard," I said. There was a brief pause. Then his tone changed instantly. "Helen." "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Is that really you?" I chuckled softly. "Last time I checked." "Good Lord," he said. "We heard about the accident. They told us you were in a coma." 7 months, I replied. Jesus, that's rough. Well, I said lightly, I guess I'm tougher than they thought. Richard laughed. That you are. So what can I do for you? I took a slow breath before answering. Richard, I need to ask you something about my house. There was a short pause. What about it? My son let his wife's parents move in while I was in the hospital. Silence. Then Richard said something very blunt. Hold on, what? They've been living there about 3 months, I continued calmly. Another pause. Then Richard spoke again. And you didn't approve that? No. His voice suddenly sounded much sharper. Helen, the deed to that property is still completely in your name. That's what I thought. Which means, he continued, no one has the legal right to live there without your permission. I leaned back slightly in the chair. Well, that's good to hear. Richard let out a small laugh. Your son really screwed this one up. I sighed softly. He thought I wasn't going to wake up. Well, he was wrong. Then Richard's voice took on that confident lawyer tone I remembered well. Tell you what, he said. You feeling strong enough to make a little trip tomorrow? To where? To your house. A slow smile formed on my face. I think I can manage that. Good, he replied. Because Helen. I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. I have a feeling your son is about to learn a very expensive lesson about property law. I chuckled quietly. Richard. Yes. Let's just say I'd really like my house back. Well then, he said confidently, let's go get it. And at that moment, for the first time since waking up from the coma, I felt something warm return to my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but determination. As tomorrow morning, I was going back to Willow Creek Drive, and the people living in my house were about to discover something. Just because a grandmother looks sweet, doesn't mean she can't fight back. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I had in years. The little clock on the nightstand at Silver Meadows said 6:12 a.m. For a moment, I just sat there quietly on the edge of the bed. My body still ached from the accident. My ribs reminded me with every deep breath that I had barely survived something terrible. But inside I felt something different. A strange mix of calm and determination. Because today was the day I was going back to Willow Creek Drive. Back to my house. Around 8 a.m. there was a knock at the apartment door. I slowly walked over and opened it. Standing there in a dark gray suit with a leather briefcase was Richard Lawson. Morning, Helen, he said with a warm smile. Well, look at you, I replied. Still dressing like a Wall Street lawyer. He chuckled. Old habits die hard. Richard stepped inside for a moment, glancing around the small apartment. He raised an eyebrow. So this is where your son parked you? I gave a small shrug. For now. Richard shook his head slightly. Helen, I'm gonna be honest with you. What's that? Your boy made a real dumb move. I couldn't help but laugh a little at that. Well, he didn't get that from me. Richard grinned. Nope, definitely not. Then he looked at his watch. Well, you ready? I nodded slowly. Oh, I'm ready. About 20 minutes later, we pulled up in front of my house on Willow Creek Drive. The moment I saw it again, my chest tightened. The big maple tree still stood proudly in the yard. The white porch railing was exactly the same. But the driveway was full of cars I didn't recognize. A big red Ford pickup truck. A dark blue SUV. And right next to the garage was a rusty old sedan that definitely didn't belong there. Richard parked the car along the curb. He looked at me. You doing all right? I took a deep breath. Yes. Then I opened the door and stepped out. Now let me tell you something, honey. Walking up that driveway felt strange. Like I was a visitor in my own life. But the moment my feet touched that front porch, something inside me shifted. Because no matter who had been living there for 3 months, this was still my home. Richard walked up beside me and rang the doorbell. Inside we heard footsteps. Heavy ones. Then the door swung open. Standing there was a large man in his late 60s wearing a stained t-shirt and holding a coffee mug. He stared at us like we had just interrupted his morning. "Yeah," he grunted. I recognized him from photos. Frank Bennett, Angela's father. His eyes moved from Richard to me, and suddenly his expression changed. Confusion, then annoyance. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. Before I could answer, a woman appeared behind him. Short gray hair, pink robe. Linda Bennett, Angela's mother. She looked at me for a moment and frowned. "Frank, who's at the—" Then she froze. "Oh." Her eyes widened slightly. "Well, look who decided to show up," she muttered. Frank turned to her. "You know this lady?" Linda crossed her arms. "That's Michael's mother." Frank blinked. "The one who was in the coma?" Linda nodded slowly. For a moment the three of us just stood there. Then Frank shrugged casually. "Well, guess you woke up." The way he said it made my stomach twist. Like my survival had been an inconvenience. Richard stepped forward calmly. "Good morning," he said politely. "My name is Richard Lawson, attorney for Helen Carter, the legal owner of this property." Frank squinted. "Legal owner?" Richard nodded. "That's correct." Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were several documents. He handed one toward Frank. "This is the property deed," Richard said calmly. "Signed and recorded under Helen Carter's name." Frank didn't even take the paper. Instead he leaned against the doorframe and scoffed. "Look, pal, we live here now." Linda nodded behind him. "Our daughter said this house belongs to Michael." I finally spoke. My voice was calm but firm. "Michael doesn't own this house." Frank chuckled. "Well, someone should have told him that before he handed us the keys." Richard sighed slightly. "Mr. Bennett, your daughter's husband had no legal authority to give you this property." Frank shrugged. "Not my problem." Linda stepped forward. "We've been living here for months," she said. "We're not going anywhere." That's when Richard said something that made the situation change very quickly. "Actually, you are." Frank frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard calmly pulled out his phone. "I've already contacted the Cleveland Police Department," he said. "They're on their way." Frank's expression darkened. "You serious right now?" Richard nodded. "Completely." Then he added one final sentence. "You're currently occupying this home illegally." The silence that followed felt heavy. Frank looked from Richard to me. Then he laughed loudly. "Oh, this is rich." He turned and shouted into the house. "Linda, you hear this?" She crossed her arms. "Oh, I hear it." Frank looked back at us. "You think some cops are gonna kick us out of here?" Richard calmly adjusted his glasses. "Yes." And right on cue, in the distance, we heard the sound of police sirens getting closer. Frank's smile slowly began to fade. And for the first time since we arrived, Angela's parents realized something very important. They weren't dealing with a weak-old woman anymore. They were dealing with the owner of the house. And things were about to get real messy. The sound of those police sirens grew louder with every passing second. At first it was faint, but then it echoed down Willow Creek Drive like a warning. Frank Bennett's smirk slowly disappeared. He stepped off the porch and looked down the street. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Two Cleveland police cruisers turned the corner and rolled slowly toward the house. The red and blue lights flashed across the quiet neighborhood. And just like that, every curtain on the street started moving. Now let me tell you something about American suburbs. When police cars show up on a quiet street at 9 in the morning, neighbors turn into detectives real quick. Mrs. Dawson, who lived across the street, stepped out onto her porch holding a coffee mug. Old Mr. Jenkins from next door walked halfway down his driveway pretending to check his mailbox. Even the teenage kid from 2 houses down suddenly decided it was the perfect time to walk his dog. Everyone was watching, and I could feel it. Frank noticed too. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at Linda. "Well, this just got awkward." Linda whispered sharply. "This is your fault, Frank. I told you Michael should have handled this." Frank shot her a look. "Oh yeah? And you were perfectly happy sleeping in that big bedroom every night." Before the argument could go any further, the police car stopped in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall man in his 40s with a calm expression. The other was a younger officer with a notepad in his hand. The taller officer walked up the driveway. "Morning, folks," he said. Richard stepped forward politely. "Officer Richard Lawson." They shook hands briefly. "I called earlier regarding an unlawful occupancy situation." The officer nodded. "You must be Miss Carter." He turned toward me. "Yes, sir," I said calmly. "My name is Helen Carter." The officer gave a respectful nod. "Ma'am." Then he turned to Frank and Linda. "And you two are?" Frank crossed his arms. "Frank Bennett." Linda added. "Linda Bennett." The officer looked between all of us. "All right. Let's figure out what's going on here." Richard opened his briefcase again and handed over the paperwork. "This property is legally owned by Helen Carter," he explained. "These individuals moved in without her permission while she was hospitalized." The officer looked down at the documents carefully. Then he nodded slowly. "So the deed is in Miss Carter's name?" "That's correct." Frank stepped forward immediately. "Hold on now," he said. "Our son-in-law told us the house belonged to him." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Is your son-in-law the legal owner of the property?" Frank hesitated. "Well, no, but that's the important part," the officer interrupted calmly. Linda suddenly spoke up. "But we've been living here for months." The younger officer finally spoke while writing something down. "That doesn't change ownership, ma'am." Frank's face turned red. "So what? You're just gonna kick us out?" The officer looked at him firmly. "Sir, if you don't have legal permission from the property owner to live here." He gestured toward me. "Then yes." For a moment nobody spoke. The quiet morning air felt heavy. Frank looked at Linda. Linda looked at the ground. Then Frank turned toward me with an irritated expression. "You really doing this?" he asked. I met his eyes calmly. "You're living in my house." He scoffed. "Yeah, well, we thought you were dead." The words hung in the air. Across the street, Mrs. Dawson gasped loudly. I took a slow breath. "Well," I said softly, "clearly that was a bad assumption." The officer stepped forward. "All right, folks," he said. "Here's what's going to happen." He pointed toward the house. "You're going to gather your belongings and leave the property." Frank threw his hands in the air. "This is unbelievable," Linda muttered under her breath. "All because she woke up." The officer's voice became firmer. "Sir, you can either cooperate, or we can escalate this situation." Frank stared at him for a long moment. Then he finally sighed. "Fine." He turned toward the house. "Linda, start packing." Linda stormed inside without another word. Frank followed her, slamming the door behind him. The street went quiet again. Neighbors were still watching, whispering. I stood there on the porch looking at the front door of my own home. After 7 months of darkness, after betrayal from my own family, I was finally standing back where I belonged. Richard leaned slightly toward me. "You doing all right, Helen?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." But deep down, I knew something else was coming, because there was one person who still hadn't shown up yet. My son. And when Michael Carter found out his in-laws were being kicked out of the house, oh boy, That was going to be a conversation none of us would ever forget. Frank and Linda Bennett had been inside the house for about 15 minutes, stomping around and slamming doors while they packed. From the porch I could hear drawers opening, cabinets banging, and Linda muttering complaints loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "This is ridiculous, absolute nonsense," she grumbled from inside. Frank shouted back from another room, "Just pack the damn boxes." The police officer stood calmly near the driveway, keeping an eye on things. Richard leaned against the porch railing beside me. Across the street, the neighborhood audience had grown even larger. Mrs. Dawson now had her husband standing beside her. Mr. Jenkins had completely given up pretending to check his mailbox and was openly watching the whole situation. A teenage girl down the street was clearly recording on her phone. You know how people are. Small-town drama spreads faster than wildfire. Richard glanced toward the street and chuckled quietly. "Well, looks like you've got a full audience." I sighed softly. Not exactly how I imagined coming home. "Well," Richard said with a small grin, "justice isn't always quiet." Just then my phone buzzed in my purse. I already knew who it was before I even looked. "Michael." I stared at the screen for a moment. Richard noticed. "Him." I nodded. "Well," he said calmly, "this should be interesting." I answered the call. "Hello, Michael." The moment he heard my voice, he exploded. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" His voice was loud enough that Richard could hear every word. I kept my tone calm. "Good morning to you too." "I just got a call from Angela," he shouted. "She said there are cops at the house kicking her parents out." I glanced at the police cars parked along the curb. "That sounds about right." "Mom, what are you doing?" he yelled. "I'm reclaiming my house." There was a long pause on the phone. Then Michael spoke again, his voice lower but filled with frustration. "You can't just throw them out like that." I looked around the porch slowly. "Oh, sweetheart, I absolutely can." Richard tried to hide a smile beside me. Michael's voice grew sharper. "They've been living there for months. And I've owned it for 32 years, I replied. Another pause. Then he sighed loudly. "Mom, you're making this way bigger than it needs to be." That sentence, that one sentence, it hurt more than anything he'd said so far. Because to him this wasn't betrayal. This wasn't disrespect. This was just an inconvenience. I spoke slowly. "You moved strangers into my house." "They're not strangers, they're family," he argued. "Not my family." The silence on the phone grew heavy. Then Michael tried a different tone. "Look, Angela's parents don't have anywhere else to go right now." I glanced at the driveway full of their vehicles. "That's unfortunate." "Mom, come on," he said. "Just give them a little more time." I leaned against the porch railing. "Michael." "Yes." "Did you ever once ask me if they could live here?" He didn't answer. "Did you ask permission before handing over the keys to my house?" Still silence. Finally he muttered, "Well, no." Exactly. Inside the house we suddenly heard a loud crash. Frank's voice echoed from the living room. "Linda, where the hell is the tape?" Linda shouted back. "You had it." The officers exchanged amused looks. Michael heard the shouting through the phone. "Oh my God," he groaned. "Mom, you've got the entire neighborhood watching this circus." "Well, maybe next time," I said calmly. "You'll think before giving away someone else's house." Michael's voice suddenly turned desperate. "Mom, please. Just wait until I get there." "Oh, I'm on my way right now." Richard raised an eyebrow when he heard that. "How long?" I asked. 20 minutes, Michael said. I looked at the police officers, then at Richard. "Well," I said slowly, "you better drive fast." "Why?" "Because your in-laws are packing." Michael's voice shot up again. "MOM." But I had already ended the call. Richard chuckled softly. Something tells me he's not happy. Oh, he's furious, I replied. Inside the house, another box slammed shut. Frank stomped toward the front door carrying 2 large suitcases. He opened the door and glared at us. You really enjoying this? He muttered. I simply smiled politely. Not particularly. He dragged the suitcases across the porch and down the steps. Linda followed behind him carrying a stack of boxes. She looked exhausted and extremely annoyed. As they loaded their things into the truck, Frank suddenly stopped and looked at me again. You know your son's gonna be here any minute. I know. And he ain't gonna be happy. I nodded calmly. I figured. Frank climbed into the truck and slammed the door. Lady, this ain't over. I watched him start the engine. Oh, Frank, I said quietly. It hasn't even started yet. And right at that moment, a black Honda Accord turned the corner at the end of the street. It was driving fast. Very fast. Richard looked down the road and smirked. Well, well. I already knew who it was. Because only one person drove like that when he was angry. My son. Michael Carter had just arrived. And judging by the look on his face as he slammed the car door, this situation was about to get a whole lot more explosive. Michael's Honda Accord screeched to a stop right in front of the house. The tires barely stopped rolling before the driver's door flew open. My son stepped out looking furious. Now I've known Michael for 40 years. I raised that boy from the time he could barely walk. I know every look on his face. And the one he had right then, that was the same look he used to get as a kid when he thought something was completely unfair. Except now, he wasn't 10 years old anymore. And this situation, well, it wasn't a playground argument. Michael slammed the car door and stormed up the driveway. Mom, he shouted. The whole street went silent. Even Frank stopped loading boxes into the truck. Michael looked around at the police cars, the neighbors watching from their lawns, and the pile of suitcases near the curb. Then he turned toward me with disbelief. You actually called the cops on them? I stood calmly on the porch. Yes. His hands flew up in frustration. Mom, this is insane. One of the officers stepped forward slightly. Sir, please keep your voice down. Michael barely glanced at him. No disrespect, officer, he said quickly, but this is a family matter. The officer folded his arms. It became a police matter when someone reported unlawful occupancy. Michael turned back to me again. You didn't have to do it like this. I looked at him quietly. How exactly should I have done it? You could have talked to me. That made Richard chuckle beside me. Michael shot him an annoyed look. And who the heck is this guy? Richard stepped forward politely. Richard Lawson. Michael frowned. That name sounds familiar. I've been your mother's attorney for about 20 years. Michael's eyes widened slightly. Oh. Then he looked back at me again. You got a lawyer involved? I nodded. Of course I did. Michael ran both hands through his hair. This is unbelievable. Behind him, Frank walked over from the truck. Michael, he said angrily. You didn't mention your mom would pull something like this. Michael turned toward him. I didn't think she would. Linda walked up beside Frank carrying another box. Well, she did, she muttered. Michael looked between them and me like he couldn't decide who to yell at first. Mom, Angela is losing her mind right now, he said. I imagine she is. You're humiliating her parents in front of the whole neighborhood. I slowly looked around the street, at the neighbors standing outside their houses, at the police officers, then back at him. No, Michael, I said calmly. You did that. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Mom, come on, he said, lowering his voice. Let's just talk about this inside. I shook my head. We're not going inside. Why not? Because they don't live here anymore. Frank scoffed loudly. Oh, really? Richard stepped forward again. Yes, really. Michael turned to him again. Can you just stay out of this? Richard smiled slightly. I'm afraid that's not possible. Why not? Because legally speaking, Richard gestured toward the house. Your mother owns this property. Michael sighed heavily. Yeah, I know that part. Do you? Richard asked. Michael rubbed his temples. Look, I was just trying to help Angela's parents. By giving away your mother's house? Richard asked. Michael snapped back. I thought she was dying. The words hung in the air. Even the neighbors across the street stopped whispering. For a moment nobody spoke. Then I said something quietly. But I didn't die. Michael looked at me. His anger softened slightly. No, you didn't. And yet, I continued, you never once asked what would happen if I woke up. He didn't answer. Frank suddenly spoke again. So what now? He asked angrily. You throwing us out on the street? I looked at the truck sitting in the driveway. You have 2 vehicles and a full tank of gas. Linda muttered under her breath. This is unbelievable. Michael looked at me again. Mom, please. His voice sounded different now. Less angry. More desperate. Just give them a few weeks. I shook my head slowly. No. Why not? Because this is my home. He sighed again. Mom, don't do this. I looked him directly in the eyes. Michael. Yes. You already did this. Behind us, the officer stepped forward again. All right, folks, he said calmly. If the occupants have finished packing, we need to clear the property. Frank threw his hands up again. Fine. He turned toward the truck angrily. Linda. Let's go. Linda slammed the tailgate shut. Frank climbed into the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, he rolled down the window and glared at me. You just made a huge mistake. I didn't respond. He started the truck and drove down the street with Linda beside him. The blue SUV followed behind them a few seconds later. The driveway finally became quiet. For the first time in months, my house stood empty again. Michael stood in the driveway staring at the road where his in-laws had disappeared. Then he turned toward me slowly. His voice was quiet now. Angela's never going to forgive you for this. I looked at him calmly. That's all right. Why? Because I'm not sure I forgive you yet either. The silence between us felt heavier than anything before. But the truth was, the real storm hadn't even started yet. Because once Angela found out her parents were gone, she was coming here next. And something told me that conversation was going to be even worse. For a few minutes after Frank and Linda drove away, the street went quiet again. The police officers were finishing their notes. Neighbors slowly began retreating back to their houses, though I could still see a few curtains moving. Michael stood in the driveway with his hands on his hips, staring at the empty road like he was trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. I leaned lightly against the porch railing. My ribs were still sore, and the morning had already taken more energy than I expected. Richard noticed. You okay, Helen? He asked quietly. I'll survive, I replied. He smiled slightly. After 7 months in a coma, I'd say you've already proven that. Just then, we heard another car turning the corner. Fast. Very fast. Michael looked up immediately. Oh no. I didn't even need to ask, because I already knew exactly who it was. A white Jeep Wrangler came flying down Willow Creek Drive and stopped hard in front of the house. The door swung open before the engine even stopped, and out stepped Angela Bennett. Now Angela usually dressed perfectly. Makeup done, hairstyled, expensive clothes. But not today. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was red. And the moment she saw the police cars, her expression turned furious. She marched straight up the driveway like a storm rolling in. Michael. My son turned toward her nervously. Angela, just calm down. Don't tell me to calm down, she snapped. Her eyes moved from him To me. Then to Richard. Then back to the house. Her voice dropped into a sharp whisper. You actually did it. I stayed calm. Yes. Angela laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You threw my parents out of the house. It's my house, I said simply. Her eyes flashed. Not anymore. Richard cleared his throat beside me. Actually. Angela cut him off immediately. I wasn't talking to you. Richard raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Angela stepped closer to the porch, pointing toward the house behind me. My parents have been living there for months. And I've owned it for 32 years, I replied. Her jaw tightened. Michael stepped between us quickly. Okay. Everyone just take a breath. Angela turned on him instantly. You said this was handled. Michael looked frustrated. I thought it was. Angela threw her hands in the air. Well, clearly it's not. She turned back to me again. You embarrassed my parents in front of the entire neighborhood. I glanced across the street where Mrs. Dawson was very obviously pretending to water her flowers while watching us. I didn't invite them to move into my house, I said calmly. Angela scoffed. Oh, please. Then she folded her arms and said something that made the air go completely still. You were in a coma. Everyone thought you were going to die anyway. The words hit like a slap. Even the police officers exchanged looks. Michael whispered quickly, Angela. But she kept going. We were just being practical. Practical. I slowly stepped forward on the porch. Practical. Angela nodded coldly. Yes. So you decided to give away my house before I was even dead? She didn't answer. Michael rubbed his face with both hands. This is getting out of control. Angela pointed at him. No, what's out of control is your mother ruining everything. I spoke again, calm but firm. Angela. She looked at me sharply. What? You're standing on my porch. So I'd suggest you lower your voice. For a moment it looked like she might explode. Then she laughed again. You know what? She said. Fine. She looked around the yard, the house, the porch. You want the house that bad? Yes, I replied simply. Angela nodded slowly. Then enjoy it. Michael looked confused. Angela. What are you doing? She grabbed his arm. We're leaving. What? You heard me. But. She pulled him toward the car. Michael looked back at me one last time. His expression was a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and something else. Maybe regret. Angela opened the Jeep door. But before getting in, she turned back toward me. Her eyes were cold. This isn't over. I met her gaze calmly. I didn't think it was. She slammed the door and started the engine. The Jeep roared to life and sped down the street. Michael sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as they disappeared around the corner. The police officers finally relaxed. One of them turned to me. Well, ma'am, he said kindly. Looks like the situation is resolved. I nodded slowly. Yes, it is. But deep down, I knew something important. This wasn't the end of the story. Because when pride and anger mix inside a family, things rarely stay quiet for long. And something told me, Michael and Angela weren't finished with me yet. After Angela's white Jeep disappeared down the street, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The police officers got back in their cruisers. The flashing lights faded. Neighbors drifted back inside their homes, though I knew good and well they'd be talking about this story over dinner for weeks. Soon the driveway was quiet again. Just me, Richard, and my son standing there looking like a man who had lost control of everything. But the silence didn't last long, because about 10 minutes later, that same white Jeep came roaring back down Willow Creek Drive. Angela slammed on the brakes so hard the tires squealed. The door flew open again and she stepped out, this time even angrier than before. Michael followed behind her. And the moment they reached the driveway, Angela started talking before anyone else could say a word. "All right," she snapped. "Let's settle this once and for all." Her voice carried across the quiet street. I stayed calm on the porch. "What's there to settle?" I asked. Angela pointed toward the house behind me. "You made it clear you want the house." "Yes." "Fine," she said sharply. Then she grabbed Michael's arm. "Because we're done." Michael looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. Angela continued. "My parents are staying with us now." Michael finally spoke, his voice low. "We'll take care of them." I nodded slightly. "That's your choice." Angela crossed her arms. "And since you obviously care more about a house than family." Her words dripped with sarcasm. "We're not coming back here again." Michael looked at the ground. Then he finally spoke to me. "Mom, Angela and I talked about it on the way here." My chest tightened slightly. "And?" He took a breath. "We're going to focus on our own life." Angela jumped in again. "Which means we won't be visiting anymore." Michael didn't disagree. He just stood there quietly. And that silence said more than anything else. Then Angela said the final sentence. "So from now on we're done." The words hung in the air like cold wind. For a moment, the only sound on the street was the leaves moving through the old maple tree in my yard. I looked at my son, the boy I raised, the boy whose scraped knees I patched up when he fell off his bike, the boy whose birthdays I celebrated in the kitchen of this very house. And now he stood there, choosing someone else, choosing pride, choosing anger. But I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just nodded slowly. "Well," I said quietly, "I wish you both the best." Angela looked surprised by how calm I sounded. Michael looked conflicted, like maybe part of him expected me to beg. But I didn't. Because sometimes the hardest truth to accept is this. You can love someone with all your heart, and they can still choose to walk away. Angela turned toward the Jeep. "Let's go," she said to Michael. He hesitated for a second. Then he looked at me one last time. "Take care of yourself, Mom." I gave him a small smile. "You too, sweetheart." Then they got in the Jeep. The engine started. And just like that, they drove away. This time for good. Richard stood beside me for a moment in silence. "Well," he finally said. "That was rough." I nodded slowly. "Yes, it was." He looked at the house. "At least you still have this." I followed his gaze. The white walls. The porch railing. The maple tree swaying gently in the wind. "My husband built this place," I said softly. "And nobody's taking it from me." Richard smiled. "Damn right." After he left, the house felt quiet again. But this time, felt like my quiet. The first thing I did was call a locksmith. Within an hour, a truck pulled into the driveway. A young man stepped out carrying a toolbox. "You the homeowner?" he asked. I smiled. "Yes, sir. I am." He replaced every single lock on the house. Front door, back door, garage, even the side gate. By the time he finished, the house was completely secure again. For the first time in months, I held the only keys. That evening I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee. The sun was setting over Willow Creek Drive, painting the sky orange and pink. The street looked peaceful again, just like it always had. But inside my chest, there was still a small ache. Because no matter what happened, Michael was still my son. And the thing that hurt the most wasn't losing him. It was realizing something much deeper. After everything he had done, he never once said I'm sorry. Not once. Not when he gave my house away. Not when he moved strangers into my bedroom. Not even when he watched me standing there after waking from a 7-month coma. That part? That hurt like hell. But eventually I stopped waiting for that apology. Because the truth finally hit me one night while I was sitting right here on this porch. When Michael gave away my house, he believed something. He believed I was already gone. To him, I was already dead. And once I understood that, everything became clear. Why waste my time worrying about someone who already buried me in his mind? Life's too short for that nonsense. So I made a decision. I stopped calling. I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping. Instead, I started living again. I planted flowers in the yard. I repainted the kitchen. I even joined a little book club down at Willow Creek Library. Turns out there's a whole world outside of family drama. And you know what? Feels pretty darn good. Now sometimes late at night I still think about Michael. Still stings a little. But then I look around this house. My house. The house my husband built. The house filled with memories that nobody could steal. And I remind myself of something important. I may have lost a son that day, but I didn't lose my dignity. And I sure as hell didn't let anyone snatch my home. So if there's one thing this old grandma learned from the whole mess, it's this. Never underestimate a woman who's fought her way back from the edge of death, especially one who still holds the keys to her own front door. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you, like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories. Tell me in the comments. What would you do if your own child gave away your house while you were in a coma?